Liberal Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan is pledging a boost to Canada's military over the next decade, and he's attached a big dollar figure to his new defence policy. $32.7 billion in defence spending by the fiscal year 2026-27. That represents a 70% hike within the next decade. Actually, I believe it's $62 billion over the next 20 years. Where is all that money going to come from? That's a question both Sajjan and Finance Minister Bill Morneau seemed unable or unwilling to answer.
When we went through the costing process, the other departments involved, and especially the Minister of Finance, gone through a very thorough process to making sure that our government will be able to commit to this.
I will be talking. You can talk to my colleague. I think that's the appropriate place to talk to about that.
He told us to talk to you.
Yeah, to be clear, Canada laying out $62 billion over the next 20 years on defence spending. Now, will that entire question be moot, since much of the increase would come during a third Liberal term? I see Susan Riley nodding her head yes over there. The Sunday Scrum is back to weigh in on that. Back with me once again from Ottawa, Susan Riley, John Ibbotson, Katie O'Malley. Susan, let's begin with you.
Yes, it is moot. It's moot for two reasons. First of all, because of the long time frame, but also because, have you noticed how military procurement works lately? The thing is, it doesn't work. It's never worked, no matter who's in charge. Stephen Harper made a valiant effort to reform it by moving the responsibility over to another department and away from defense. Jean Chrétien had his own solutions that he tried. We can't seem to buy a helicopter or a ship if our lives depended on it. It's a mess, and I think it will continue to be a mess. I was really I thought this was a very disappointing defense paper that the minister put out. It's essentially just a general's wish list, essentially something for everybody. It covers everything. It wasn't. There are no specifics. I mean, there was no new thinking that I could see. Why do we need, for example, 15 warships? Why does Canada need 15 warships? Are we expecting the Spanish Armada to show up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence? You know how they always say generals fight the last war. I guess journalists probably fight the current war. But you know, it doesn't reflect. I think it didn't reflect strongly enough the real perils that we face, which at this point are non-state actors, so-called terrorists. To me, it was a really weak document that we shouldn't really take seriously or waste too much time on.
Katie, I noticed your reaction on this. The eyebrows were going up and down a mile a minute.
I'm not a poker player, as you can all tell. I'm not actually disagreeing with Susan, although I do think there actually was a lot of stuff in the document about sort of cybercrime and looking at sort of intelligence gathering and taking a more, I guess, modern approach. It didn't really get the same level of coverage and attention because it didn't involve a 70% increase in spending, which is just a vast sum of money beyond which many of us could actually sort of process. So I think that, you know, just a slight defense of the minister there. They did actually address other issues as well. It's just that the headline, the main line story was the spending. I totally agree with Susan in that it is, I mean, we're talking about 10 years from now. Who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what'll change? Who knows how, again, how technology might alter to the point where we're going to be redoing those wish lists. I think it's really hard to write or put out a defense white paper that isn't going to seem dated the second it hits the table. That's just the reality of the way things change.
John?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that following his enormous election win in 2015, Stephen Harper's fourth government is proceeding exactly as expected. It just seems to me remarkable to what extent the Trudeau government is the Harper government, especially in areas of foreign policy and defense, and also, by the way, on environment, climate change targets as well. But you could imagine Stephen Harper confronted with Donald Trump having his foreign minister say what Chrystia Freeland said, that we will be part of the West, even if the United States isn't. And you can imagine him deciding that we have to ramp up defense spending.
Katie, you don't agree with that?
I'm just trying to picture it.
The point is, the commitment is there. You can have a commitment that's not lived up to. Lord knows when it comes to procurement, there are commitments that have not been lived up to. But at least you have a commitment on paper that you have to not live up to, as opposed to simply carrying on. And I suspect that if the world really has changed, if there has been a fundamental shift in the nature of the Western Alliance, that Canada will have to increase its defense spending, whether it wants to or not. And that will mean increased taxes, that will mean deficits, that will mean cuts to health care and education, because we have, for decades now, had a pathetically weak defense posture, 1% of GDP. It will now go up to 1.4%. At least, as I say, it's on the books. At this point, in this environment, I think the Liberals are genuinely committed to doing it.
The timing, though, didn't go unnoticed. Just a couple of weeks after Donald Trump called out NATO members for not paying their fair share, a White House spokesperson gave Trump credit for the new defense policy. Let's take a look at that tweet. POTUS getting results. NATO member Canada will increase military spending 70% over the next decade. Do any of you believe that this is related to the Canadian decision to chart its own sovereign course?
Yes, I think it's more, though, to kind of please NATO. And I also think it's essentially a mythical pledge. I'll be stunned if that much money is spent over the course of time. But I think it's a political message both to NATO. The U.S. might be thinking about backing off. We're not. We're here. We're involved. It also marks a significant shift in Justin Trudeau's rhetoric. His argument before, whenever questioned about our relatively weak financial commitment to NATO, was, well, we might not put in as much money as some other countries, but we're always in the front lines. We're always there when we're needed. And there's I think 400 military left for Latvia on a NATO mission this week. So Canada has not been invisible or has not been a freeloader in this regard. So I think that's kind of the message that was intended as much for Europe as for the U.S. But again, I just don't think any of this money is going to be spent. And let me just, while we're talking about, why have we suddenly jumped from needing 65 fighter jets to 88? Again, this number just appears out of nowhere.
Well,
there's no explanation.
Let me play, actually, since you raised that question, let me play what Chrystia Freeland had to say about that, why they wanted to up the defense spending in her speech. Let's take a listen to that clip.
Why invest billions to maintain a capable, professional, well-funded, and well-equipped Canadian military? The answer is obvious. To rely solely on the U.S. security umbrella would make us a client state. And although we have an incredibly good relationship with our American friends and neighbors, such a dependence would not be in Canada's interest. That is why doing our fair share is clearly necessary. It is why our commitment to NORAD and to our strategic relationship with the United States is so critical. It is by pulling our weight in this partnership and in all our international partnerships that we, in fact, have weight.
Susan, does that answer your question?
No, it doesn't at all. It still doesn't say what are those 88 fighter jets supposed to be doing. Obviously, some of them will be deployed to NATO to help on various missions. But how much success have we had bombing Libya? How much success have the Allied forces had bombing Syria? I mean, how successful is that? And if we're talking about protecting our own borders, particularly our northern border, with warplanes, are we going to still buy the F-35s because of the famous inoperability, or are we going to try to find a plane that suits the long distances involved in patrolling the Canadian North? But finally, let me say that part of the reason Trudeau was elected the last time, and there were many reasons, but one of them was that he was totally against that F-35 project that Harper was involved in. Although even Harper was a bit hesitant as the prices continued to rise. So costs, I should say, continued to rise. So I just find this is muddled. I can't take it seriously.
Let me jump in with some breaking news. CBC News has confirmed that a spokesperson for Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan says Canada has received a request from the U.S. via NATO to provide police trainers for Afghanistan, and the government is reviewing the request, but right now focusing on Canada's financial assistance to Afghanistan. All right, John, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, we have been hearing warnings coming out of the United States for months now that the situation in Afghanistan is not stable, quelle surprise, and that there's going to need to be a greater NATO presence moving back into the country. And the Trudeau government has been as resistant as the Harper government was to any thoughts of recommitting to Afghanistan. So there will be a long, hard look at that, I'm sure. But speaking of Trudeau being Harper 2.0, the other thing that we didn't see in that foreign policy speech or in that defense paper was any commitment to peacekeeping. It was the one thing that Justin Trudeau was committed to doing differently from Stephen Harper in the area of foreign policy. And 2 years in, it's getting perfectly clear that peacekeeping really in this decade of this century is not anything remotely close to what it was in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. It's messy. It's in many ways brutal, and clearly we want no part of it. And I suspect we don't want any part of an Afghanistan redeployment either. No,
exactly. All the money and lives lost and all the money spent on Afghanistan resulted in failure, at least status quo at best, but failure. So since it didn't work the first time, let's do it again. I mean, is that the argument? I think there's a real opening here for an articulate and intelligent alternative left view on how we should be, what role Canada should play as a military power. Mine, I'm willing to help them draft it. No, I'm just kidding.
You know what, it's funny, I'm just going to end on this note because John Yi Chung writes, Susan, you're my favorite pundit, but I want to, Carol, you might want a reminder of the rescue request our Navy were called in to perform this weekend, drug enforcement too, talking about what the RCN actually does with our fleet. So maybe there are some ideas for you about what our fleet does. Katie, last word to you.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to point out that training, specifically, if that's what the request is, that's one of the things that both Stephen Harper and I think the Trudeau government has carried on. We really highlight that as something Canada can do, as opposed to just sending straight boots into the ground. This notion of sort of training the trainers, training soldiers, getting involved in the logistics, that is something that Canada tends to be a little more willing to consider than sort of a straight military operation. So perhaps that'll make them look more fondly on such a request.